It depends how you're using the term Calvinism. If you remember back to the rise of the so-called young restless and reformed 12, 13 years ago, figures like Mark Driscoll, etc., being characterized as Calvinistic. And by and large, it seems to me that what was meant there was not even the 5 points, the so-called tulip of Calvinism. What was meant was a kind of basic commitment to a kind of anti-Pelagian understanding of salvation. So there are some very loose ways of using the term Calvinism. Typically, I think I would say that what we more appropriately call Calvinism, which is the ecclesiastical tradition that seeks to represent the Reformed faith, is defined often by, well, in terms of Presbyterianism, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the catechisms, and in terms of the continental tradition, the canons of Dort, the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism. None of those documents, of course, were written by Calvin. But I think it's arguable that there's very little in those documents that Calvin would have taken exception to. So I think Calvinism can be just a synonym for the Reformed tradition when we're thinking confessionally. In more popular circles, it tends to mean an anti-Pelagian view of salvation, neither of which track back directly, immediately, and perfectly to Calvin himself. I think it's a term that is broadly used, and what we did in the book was we tried to respect that breadth of meaning as well. And when we came to the Calvinism section of the book, we're not looking at, okay, who uses Calvin in their thinking. We're thinking in much broader terms. I think they're thinking of the Reformed faith as such.
I think, the term Calvinism was invented while Calvin was still alive. And in his lectures on the book of Daniel, which was at the very end of his life, he says, people speak of Calvinism. And he says, there's no such thing. There are no Calvinists. We are Christians. And, Zwingli had faced the same thing when he was accused of being a Lutheran. Reformed is in some ways preferable because it respects the diversity of the tradition in a way that Calvinism seems to preclude. And, if we're going to talk about the Reformed tradition, we have to think about Arminianism. We have to think about the liberal tradition of the Reformed in the 19th century. We have to think about Karl Barth. Are you going to call Karl Barth a Calvinist? Well, that becomes a very problematic issue. Emil Brunner, who regarded himself in the Reformed tradition, do we see him as a Calvinist? Brunner and Barth, of course, famously disagreed on what Calvin actually said. And so, we say that in our introduction, that although this is the Oxford Handbook of Calvin and Calvinism, it is probably more historically and theologically responsible to speak about it in terms of Reformed, because it's not monocausal. It's a tradition that has many different lines to it, and what is fascinating is that many people will claim Calvin, but they're claiming a very different Calvin when they read him in very different ways and claim his inheritance. So you get to the point of, will the real Calvin please stand up?
And I mean, if you look at a character like John Owen in the 17th century, who might popularly be referred to as the greatest Calvinist theologian in England in the 17th century, I think it's true to say that he cites Augustine and Aquinas far more frequently and regularly than he does John Calvin. So again, that goes to Bruce's comment that not only is the Reformed tradition, if you like, pluriform in terms of 16th and 17th century figures, it's also Catholic in a way that points back before the Reformation and draws on what we would now call patristic and medieval sources for its formulations. So Calvinism is in some ways, it's a mischievous word. If you allow it to take on a life of its own, it's a mischievous word. If you roughly translate it as Reformed tradition, I think you don't go too far wrong.